Have you ever seen a man who spent half his life running away from pain? Accidentally meet a woman who had just been abandoned at the altar in that windy frontier. A lonely cowboy found his spurned bride, and from that moment, their lives took an unexpected turn. But standing in the middle of the vast wilderness, where the cold can kill and prejudices can choke the heart, what will they choose? Choose to close their hearts for safety, or dare to open their hearts even though they know the past can pull them down again? If it were you, after a lifetime of so much loss, would you have the courage to allow yourself to love again? A story of loneliness, choices, and the quiet strength of two broken souls. If you believe that people, no matter their age, deserve a new beginning. Join me on this journey that touches your heart. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on emotional stories like this. The wind always found a way through the cracks of Elias Carter's cabin. It slipped through the narrow seams between the old pine logs and curled around the wooden floorboards like a restless spirit searching for warmth. Out here, on the northern plains of Wyoming, winter didn't simply arrive, it claimed. It came with a kind of slow, merciless certainty that had shaped both the land and the people who dared to stay. Elias Carter was one of them. At 40 years old, he lived alone on 80 acres of stubborn earth and wind-burnt grass, 12 miles west of Clayridge, a town barely large enough to have a sheriff's office and a church. His cabin stood near the edge of a dry creek bed, its stones stacked by his own hands, its roof mended more times than he cared to count. It had once been a home meant for a family. Now, it was little more than a shelter for a man who had forgotten what a warm voice sounded like at night. The morning began the same way every winter morning did. Elias rose before the sun, shrugged into his worn canvas coat, and pulled on a pair of cracked leather boots that had traveled more miles than any man should in one lifetime. The cabin, still dark, still cold, groaned as if in sympathy when he stepped outside. Frost clung to the porch railings like powdered sugar, and the fields stretched wide and silver under the moon's last breath of light. His horse, Bramble, snorted from the small corral a few yards away. Elias walked over, his footsteps crunching through 3 inches of crusted snow. "Mornin', old boy," he murmured, voice low and steady. He ran a hand along the gelding's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, a silent greeting the kind Elias had grown used to. Words were scarce out here, and, truth be told, he didn't miss them much, or at least, that's what he told himself. He saddled Bramble, tightened the cinch, and gathered the old rifle he carried not for trouble, but for coyotes that grew bold when their hunger outpaced their fear. The wind pushed hard against his back as he rode toward the lower pasture. Snow dusted across his coat, melting quick, leaving dark spots like tears he'd never shed. Not anymore. By the time he checked the herd and repaired a section of fence splintered from last night's gusts, the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the horizon. A pale, weak light, the kind that offered no warmth but reminded you daylight still existed. He rode back slowly, letting Bramble pick the pace. There was no need to rush. There never was. Inside the cabin, a small fire fought to stay alive. Elias knocked snow from his coat, hung it by the hearth, and sat at the small table that had room for 4, but held only 1. He poured himself a cup of black coffee bitter enough to match the morning, and stared at the empty chair across from him. 10 years had passed. Yet some habits refused to die. He remembered her then. Claire. The way she used to hum in the mornings. The way she'd brush his sleeve as she walked by. A small touch that meant everything. The way her hand had slipped from his in that burning barn as smoke stole the very breath from her lungs. He shut his eyes, jaw tightening. 10 years, and still the cold inside him was deeper than the winter outside. He stood abruptly, pushing the chair back until its legs scraped across the floor. The cabin felt smaller when memories visited. too small for a man who had spent a decade trying to outrun grief. He grabbed his gloves and stepped outside again, welcoming the sting of the wind as if it were a punishment he deserved. By noon, clouds rolled in, thick, gray, heavy. Snow was coming, the kind that could bury a whole week beneath it. He saddled Bramble again. He needed nails for the broken fence, coffee for the week, maybe some kerosene. A man living alone always found a reason to go to town, even if that reason was nothing more than the echo of another human voice. Clayridge sat along a main dirt road that stretched between two frozen ridges. The town's single row of wood-fronted buildings huddled together like travelers begging warmth from one another. As Elias approached, he saw smoke rising from chimneys, heard the faint ring of a hammer from the blacksmith's, and caught the faint murmur of people gathering near the church. He tied Bramble near the general store and pushed the door open. A gust of warm air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of spices, kerosene, and the faint sweetness of boiled sugar candies. Morning. Elias called Martha Jennings, the store's owner. She stood behind the counter, her hair pinned neatly, her apron dusted with flour. "Haven't seen you for a spell." "Been busy," he replied, setting a small list on the counter. She nodded, pulling items down with practiced hands. "You hear about the wedding today? Poor Marian Ellis?" Her voice softened, almost dropping to a whisper. "Left standing at the altar." Elias paused mid-reach as he was about to pick up a tin of coffee. Martha continued, voice hushed but urgent. "Hollis Wren took the early stage to Cheyenne. Didn't even say goodbye. Just left her there, dressed in white, standing in front of everybody as if she weren't worth the dust on his boots." Elias didn't respond. He felt the weight of something in his chest, something he couldn't yet name. He tucked the tin of coffee under his arm and stepped outside. The church bell was ringing, slow and steady, though the ceremony had ended before it began. Snow had begun to fall soft flakes at first, drifting lazily in the wind, and that's when he saw her. A woman stood alone on the steps of the small wooden church, her white dress heavy with melted snow. Her veil had been removed, but her hair dark chestnut with soft waves hung loosely around her shoulders. She held the skirt of her gown with one hand, as if the weight of it might pull her to the ground. She looked lost. Not in the way someone might lose their way in the woods, but in the way a person loses a piece of themselves they thought they could count on. Elias stopped in the middle of the road. Something deep inside him, something buried under years of cold and silence, shifted. He didn't move at first, didn't speak. He simply watched as she brushed a tear from her cheek, trying hard to hide the gesture, trying hard to stand upright in a moment designed to break her. A horse snorted nearby, drawing her attention. She turned slightly, and her eyes met his. They were the saddest eyes he had ever seen. But beneath the sadness was a steadiness, a strength he recognized. It was the same strength that had kept him alive these past 10 years. He walked toward her, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had weathered storms before. When he reached the base of the steps, he removed his hat. Snow dusted his shoulders, clung to the brim of his coat, melted into his dark hair. "Ma'am," he said gently, voice low and respectful. "You shouldn't be out here in the cold." She swallowed, her lips trembling from the wind. "I suppose it doesn't matter anymore." "Of course it does," he answered. She let out a breath, shaky and thin. The man I was going to marry, he left, before the vows, before anything. Elias held her gaze, his own eyes soft with something she couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said. "No one deserves a hurt like that." Marian Ellis tried to smile, but it faltered midway. "That kind of pain tells you something. I guess." Her voice cracked. "Maybe I wasn't worth staying for." The wind howled, whipping loose strands of her hair across her face. Elias stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his coat, close enough for her to see that he wasn't pitying her, he was witnessing her. He spoke quietly, so only she could hear. "If they didn't see your worth," he said, "then that's their loss." He paused, the faintest drawing of breath. And maybe someone else's treasure. Her eyes widened, not in surprise, but in recognition, like she had just heard the first kind words spoken to her all morning. Snow continued to fall, catching in her hair like scattered stars. For the first time in years, Elias felt something stir inside him. Not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth. Something he had once believed was gone forever. And standing there, in the falling snow, with a woman left alone on her wedding day, looking at him as if he might be the first safe thing she'd found in years. Elias Carter understood one truth. The world had a strange way of bringing together the broken, and sometimes it did so on days when both had already given up hope. The snow thickened, drifting sideways under a sharp Wyoming wind. Elias stood beside the church steps, hat in hand, unsure whether to speak again or simply offer his silence, the kind of silence that didn't wound, but instead waited, patient and steady. Marian Ellis blinked through the falling snow, tears drying on her cheeks as the cold stiffened the fabric of her ruined wedding dress. "I didn't think anyone would stop," she murmured. Her voice was thin, barely audible beneath the wind. Elias shifted slightly, his boots creaking over the thin layer of ice forming on the wooden planks. "I reckon folks don't always know what to say," he answered, "but that doesn't mean you should face a moment like this alone." Marian looked away, her gaze drifting toward the long road that cut through Clayridge, empty now, except for blowing snow and the faint wheel tracks from the stagecoach that had carried Hollis Wren away that morning. Her breath trembled out in small clouds. "I thought I knew him," she whispered. "Thought I understood what kind of man he was. I thought he could see the good in me." The last words fell out like a confession she hadn't meant to release. Elias felt a pull in his chest. Not pity, he'd never insult her with that. What he felt was recognition, that quiet echo of grief and disappointment that came from having once expected more from life than it chose to give. "You deserve someone who stays," he said simply. Marian swallowed hard, nodding even though she didn't seem convinced. A gust of wind cut between them, lifting the edge of her wet skirt. She shivered. Elias noticed how her fingers trembled, not the delicate shiver of a bride in shock, but the deeper shake of someone whose skin was losing warmth fast. "You'll freeze out here," he said. "There's a bit of shelter at the general store. Warm stove. You can sit while things settle." She hesitated. Her eyes, soft hazel, ringed red from crying, moved across his face as if searching for any trace of judgment. But Elias Carter wasn't a man who judged easily. Life had taught him what brokenness looked like. Life had also taught him to tread gently around people who were hurting. Finally, she nodded. "All right." He offered his arm, not out of formality, but because the ground was slick with frost and her shoes weren't made for winter roads. She slipped her hand lightly against his sleeve. The touch was feather soft, but Elias felt it like a reminder of something human, something long gone from his life. They walked slowly toward the store, passing a few townsfolk who pretended not to stare. Some whispered, some watched openly. A bride in a ruined gown walking with a solitary cowboy was a sight that begged for gossip, even on a day meant for kindness. Inside the general store, warmth wrapped around them like a quilt. Martha Jennings gasped aloud when she saw Marian. "Good heavens. Child, come sit by the stove. Elias, grab her a blanket." Elias nodded and fetched a wool blanket from a shelf while Martha guided Marian to a wooden chair near the potbelly stove. The heat was immediate, sending small curls of steam rising from the hem of Marian's damp gown. Martha tisked under her breath as she inspected the shivering woman. "That man ought to be ashamed," she muttered. "Leaving you like that? I swear some men ain't worth the spit it'd take to curse them." Marian lowered her gaze. The words weren't cruel, but they carried weight. Too much weight for someone already struggling to stand upright inside her own skin. Elias returned with the blanket and draped it gently over Marian's shoulders. She looked up at him, gratitude softening the tight lines of her face. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once. Simple. Quiet. A man who had learned that sometimes words did more harm than good. Martha handed Marian a cup of warm water, no tea left in the canister, and patted her shoulder before returning to the counter, muttering something about men who forget their vows before they even take them. For a long moment, the only sound was the pop of burning wood inside the stove. Marian inhaled deeply, her trembling finally settling. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. "I didn't mean to make a scene in your town. People shouldn't have to see this." Elias leaned against a nearby shelf, arms crossed loosely over his chest. "Life happens in front of people whether we like it or not," he said, "and most folks forget faster than we think." She let out a shaky laugh, not from amusement, more from exhaustion. "Do you always speak so plainly?" "Mr. Carter," he supplied. "Elias Carter?" "Well, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "I appreciate the honesty." He dipped his head in a modest half-nod. "Sometimes honesty's all a man's got." The warmth from the stove eased some color back into her cheeks. Elias watched silently, noticing the way she held her hands near the heat, palms open, as if trying to gather herself in pieces. There was a fragility to her, but beneath it he saw something else, something steady trying to push through the hurt. After a while, she lifted her gaze again. "Can I ask you something? You can... Why did you stop? Why help a stranger on a day like this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the frosted window, where snow still fell thick over the street. He thought of the morning, of waking alone in a cabin built for more than one. He thought of the ache that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. "Because I know what it looks like," he said quietly. What looks like?" she whispered. "Standing alone when you shouldn't have to." Her eyes softened. It wasn't a sentimental moment, just real. The kind of real that older souls understood. The kind that didn't need embellishment. The door opened again, bringing in a rush of cold air and two women from town. Their eyes went wide when they saw Marian. One whispered, "Bless her heart," while the other nudged her toward the back of the store. Marian bit her lip, her shoulders curling inward. Elias straightened. "You don't have to stay in town for now," he said. "If you need a place to collect yourself, my cabin's got a fire going and 4 walls that don't listen to gossip." She blinked at him, startled by the offer. "I couldn't possibly impose." "It's not imposing." He cut in gently. "It's shelter." She hesitated again. Her face held a mixture of pride, fear, and exhaustion. A woman trying to stand tall after having the ground taken from beneath her feet. "I don't know anyone here," she whispered. "You do now," he answered. She looked down at her ruined dress, the shredded hem stained with slush. She looked at her bare hands, chapped from cold and heartbreak. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. And this time, the gratitude didn't tremble, it settled. They left the store minutes later, Marian wrapped in Elias's blanket, her steps careful but resolute. The snowstorm was worsening, flurries turning into thick waves of white that blurred the edges of the town. Elias helped her onto Bramble's back, then mounted behind her, steady and sure. She held the blanket tight as the horse started forward. "Will it take long?" she asked as they crossed the edge of town. "About an hour," he replied. "Snow might slow us some." The wind howled across the wide plain. Marian leaned slightly back, not against him, but near enough to feel grounded. Her shoulders loosening with each step the horse took toward safety. Clayridge slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead lay only snow, wind, and the faint silhouette of a cabin waiting in the distance, a small light in an unforgiving land. A place where two wounded lives, by sheer accident or quiet fate, were now headed together. They didn't speak the rest of the way. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence, when shared, was a kind of strength. The snow grew heavier as Elias guided Bramble across the open plain. Wind swept from the north in cold sheets, turning the world into a silent expanse of white. Marian held the wool blanket close around her shoulders, her breath forming pale clouds that vanished as quickly as they came. She did not speak, but her posture straight, despite the cold, told Elias she was fighting to remain composed. The horse moved steadily through the drifts, each step muffled by the deepening snow. Elias kept one arm lightly braced behind Marian, not touching her but ready should she slip. Out here, small acts meant survival. He wasn't thinking about propriety, nor the whispers of Clayridge. He was thinking of getting her someplace warm before the storm worsened. After nearly an hour, the land shifted into familiar contours, the soft rise of a ridge, the dip of a creek bed now frozen solid. Elias finally saw the dark outline of his cabin ahead, smoke drifting from the chimney like a quiet promise. "There," he said gently, leaning just close enough for his voice to carry above the wind. "We're almost home." Marian let out a breath that trembled with relief rather than fear. When they reached the cabin, Elias swung down first. Snow clung to his coat in white flecks as he steadied Bramble and reached up to help Marian dismount. She hesitated, not because she feared him, but because stepping off meant facing whatever came next inside a stranger's home, on a day when her entire life had unraveled. "It's all right," Elias said, his tone soft but sure. "I've got you." She slid down carefully, and for a brief second, her hand rested on his shoulder. A small touch, a brief warmth, but it settled something inside him he didn't expect. He led her toward the door, brushing snow from the porch with his boot before pushing it open. Warmth greeted them soft, flickering light from the hearth, the faint smell of wood smoke, and the quiet creak of an old home that had weathered countless winters. "Come in," Elias said, holding the door wide. Marian stepped inside, blinking slowly as her eyes adjusted to the dim glow. The cabin was rustic, yet tended with care, a pine table with 4 chairs, a stone hearth with a cast-iron kettle hanging over embers, shelves lined with jars of beans and dried herbs. A quilt lay folded neatly on a cedar chest, and near the far wall stood a small bookcase, its contents sparse but well kept. "It's warm," she said softly. Elias removed his coat and hung it by a wooden peg near the hearth. "Fire keeps well if you feed it enough. Sit by the stove. I'll fetch something dry for you to change into." She hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you more than I already have." "You're not trouble," he replied, his voice low, firm. "You're cold." He stepped into the small back room. Marian stood near the fireplace, holding her hands out toward the flames. Her dress, once white and meant for celebration, now hung heavy and stained from the road. She looked at it as if it belonged to someone else. When Elias returned, he carried a folded wool shirt, a soft flannel, and a pair of clean, thick socks. "They're going to be big on you," he said, "but warm." He set them gently on the table. "Take your time. I'll be outside brushing down Bramble." Marian nodded. "Thank you." He stepped out, closing the door behind him. Cold air hit his face sharply, waking thoughts he'd tried to bury for years. Here he was, Elias Carter, a man who had spent a decade keeping everyone at a distance, inviting a woman into his home. A woman who had just been abandoned by the one person meant to stand beside her. He exhaled slowly, steam pouring from his lungs. "It's just kindness," he muttered to himself. "That's all this is. But even he knew the truth wasn't that simple. After brushing down Bramble and settling the horse with feed, Elias returned to the cabin, knocking lightly before entering. Marian sat near the fire in the clothes he'd provided. She had braided her damp hair loosely over one shoulder, and though the flannel draped off her frame, she somehow looked more herself than she had in that ruined gown. Her wedding dress lay folded carefully near the hearth, drying. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking up. "I didn't know where else to put it." "It's fine," he said. "You can leave it there." She paused, watching him with an expression that hovered between gratitude and disbelief. "I didn't expect all this kindness." Elias busied himself at the stove, lifting the kettle and pouring hot water into 2 tin cups. He added a pinch of dried mint from a jar on the shelf, a luxury in these parts, but one he saved for nights when the air felt too heavy with memories. He handed her a cup. "Mint tea. Helps warm from the inside." She accepted it carefully, wrapping both hands around it. "Thank you. Elias." The way she said his name, gentle, almost calming, made him avert his gaze. He took a seat across from her at the table. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the quiet whistle of wind pressing against the cabin walls. Finally, Marian broke the silence. "Does it always blow like this out here most winters?" he said. "Sometimes it gets worse than this. Plains don't offer much shelter. They make you tough, or they break you." She nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. "I suppose today proved that I'm not as tough as I thought." Elias leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but soft. "You're stronger than you know." Her eyes lifted. "You say that so easily." "I say it because it's true." Marian looked back at the fire, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought Hollis and I were building a life together. I thought I had finally found a place to belong." And then her voice faltered. Elias didn't speak. He didn't reach across the table or offer platitudes. He simply let her grief settle into the room, letting it breathe. Some pains weren't meant to be smothered. Some needed space. After a long moment, Marian drew a slow breath. "It's strange," she said. "When you stand there alone in front of a church, you don't think about the ceremony or the people watching. You just think, 'What did I do wrong?'" "You didn't do wrong," Elias said quietly. "You trusted the wrong man. There's a difference." Another stillness passed between them, this one lighter, quieter. A log shifted in the hearth, sending sparks upward. Marian watched the embers rise, her face softening under the warm glow. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "You don't have to know it today," he replied. "Storms pass. Snow melts. You'll see clearer when the morning comes." She studied him for a long moment, her expression searching. "Did someone teach you to say things like that?" she asked gently. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No," he said. "Life did." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His tone carried a history she could feel but not yet understand. She nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth she wasn't ready to pry into. Elias cleared his throat and stood. "You should rest. You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I can't take your room," she protested. "You're not taking anything," he replied, calm but firm. "You've had a long day, and the bed's warmer. Just this once." She looked as if she wanted to argue, but instead her gaze softened. "All right," she whispered. He guided her to the small bedroom, lit by a single oil lamp. The quilt on the bed was patched and faded but clean-stitched by a woman who had once loved this home deeply. Marian paused in the doorway. "Elias." He turned. "Thank you. For all of this." He nodded once. "Get some rest." When she closed the door, Elias returned to the table, staring at the empty cup she'd left behind. Something stirred inside him again. something he didn't dare name. He added wood to the fire, stretching out on the rug with his back against the wall. The storm outside howled through the long Wyoming night, but inside the cabin, warmth held firm. Elias looked toward the closed bedroom door. He whispered into the glow of the firelight, words meant only for himself. "Don't get foolish. Carter, she's hurt. She needs kindness. Not company." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. For the first time in 10 years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty, and that scared him more than any winter storm ever could. Long after Marian closed the door to the small bedroom, Elias remained awake beside the fire. The flames crackled softly, throwing shifting patterns of gold and amber across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm battered against the windows, sweeping snow sideways in relentless waves. But inside, a gentler kind of storm had settled, one that stirred beneath the surface of a man who had lived too long without warmth. He pulled the wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, the familiar weight grounding him. For years, he had ended his nights in this very spot, leaning back against a log wall, listening to the wind howl over the plains, convincing himself that silence was enough, that it was safer, that he needed nothing more. But tonight felt different. He could hear faint movements behind the closed door, soft footsteps, the creak of the floorboard, the quiet rustling of fabric as Marian settled into the bed. Every sound reminded him that someone else now breathed under his roof. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have shaken him. But it did, because it had been 10 years since he'd heard another person moving softly in the night. 10 years since he'd felt a presence in this home that wasn't memory or ghost. He exhaled slowly. "This ain't smart, Carter," he murmured to himself, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "You don't know her. She don't know you. Don't go remembering things that ain't coming back." Yet his thoughts drifted anyway. Hours passed. The fire dimmed to a red glow, embers pulsing like the slow beat of a tired heart. Elias finally lay down, eyes heavy, the warmth wrapping around him in uneven pockets. He slept only a short while before a small sound woke him. A soft cry, barely audible, like someone trying very hard not to be heard. He sat up, fully alert. The storm outside had quieted to a low moan, but the sound came from inside the bedroom. Another muffled sob followed. Elias hesitated. A man like him didn't intrude where he wasn't invited. But grief had a way of cutting through walls both wooden and human, and the sound of Marian quietly breaking inside that room pulled at him more sharply than he expected. He rose slowly, brushing dust from his shirt, and walked toward the bedroom door. He did not knock. Instead, he spoke in a low voice meant not to startle. "Marian." Silence. Then a shaky breath. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. A long pause. Then her voice fragile. "Frayed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," he said. "Storms keep me up. Thought maybe you needed something." Another hesitation, the kind that comes when a person wants to be strong but no longer has the strength. Just a hard night," she whispered. Elias didn't push the door open. He simply leaned against the wall outside, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "Hard nights happen," he said softly, "especially after the kind of day you had." Inside, the bed creaked as she shifted. "I shouldn't be crying," she said, her voice trembling. "It's foolish. He didn't want me. That should tell me all I need to know." Elias inhaled slowly through his nose, choosing his words with care. "Being hurt don't make you foolish," he said. "It makes you human." Another quiet sob drifted through the wood. "It wasn't just losing him," she whispered. "It was standing there in front of everyone, feeling like I wasn't worth staying for, feeling like every hope I'd held on to was just some silly dream." Her voice cracked on the last word. Elias closed his eyes, the sound of her pain stirring something heavy in his chest. He knew what it felt like to lose a future. He knew the weight of hope turning into ash. "You're worth more than he'd have ever seen," he said quietly. "That ain't a line for comfort. It's the truth." There was a shift inside the room, as if she leaned closer to the door. "You say that so easily." "It ain't easy," he replied. "It's just plain." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Marian whispered, "I feel embarrassed, humiliated. The whole town saw. Clayridge folks forget quick," he said. "Plains teach people to mind their own pain." A faint laugh, wet, fragile, escaped her. "That doesn't sound very comforting." Didn't mean it to be. Meant it to be true. Another silence settled between them. A softer one this time. Then Marian spoke again. Her voice was barely above a breath. "You've been through something like this, haven't you?" Elias didn't answer right away. He stared at the floorboard, jaw tightening. "A long time ago," he said finally. "What happened?" He considered the door the barrier between them that felt both necessary and too thin. "Someone I cared for," he said slowly, "didn't make it through a winter storm, lost her, and the child we were expecting." Marian drew in a quiet, startled breath. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Elias replied. "Life deals its hand. You play it best you can, but you still carry it," she whispered. He nodded once, though she couldn't see. "Some pains you don't put down. You just learn to walk with them." Another pause filled the hallway. The storm moaned outside, then softened, becoming nothing more than a breath against the windows. Then Marian spoke again, delicate, hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Elias." "You can. Why were you so kind to me today? You don't even know me." He swallowed, the question hitting deeper than he expected. "Because people deserve to be helped, especially when they're hurting." "That's a simple answer. It's the only one I got," he said. "And you remind me that people still need each other, even out here." Her breath softened. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not." Another silence. Warm. Close. "Thank you," she whispered, "for talking to me, for being here." Elias rested his hand lightly against the doorframe, never touching the wood, but close enough to feel connected somehow. "If you need anything," he said, "I'm right outside." She nodded on the other side, as if he could see it. "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Marian." He stepped away slowly, returning to the rug near the fireplace. He lay down, staring at the low flicker of the embers, listening as her breathing slowly steadied beyond the door. He knew better than to let his thoughts wander where they shouldn't. Knew better than to imagine that one night of shared pain meant anything more. But even knowing that, something inside him shifted. For 10 years, nights had passed in silence, quiet, empty, unchanging. Tonight, the silence wasn't hollow. It wasn't cold. It felt shared. And that frightened Elias Carter in a way he didn't have the words for. As the fire dimmed to a smolder, he whispered into the darkness quiet enough that only the walls could hear, "Don't go hoping. Carter, don't start what you can't finish." But beneath the warning was a truth he couldn't deny. Something in him had begun to thaw. And in a land ruled by winter, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Elias woke before dawn, as he always did. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of embers resting beneath a thin layer of ash. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the land blanketed in a deep, untouched quiet. Snow covered everything in a clean white sheet that seemed to erase the chaos of the day before. For a moment, he lay still, listening. The rhythmic whisper of wind slipping between the logs, the slow pop of cooling embers, and beneath it, the soft, steady breathing of another person just a room away. It had been a long time since his mornings had included someone else. He sat up slowly, pulling the blanket from his shoulders. His back ached from sleeping on the rug, but he welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him that yesterday truly had happened, that Marian Ellis was asleep under his roof, that she'd spoken to him through tears in the dark, and that he, somehow, had become the one she reached toward when the night felt too heavy. He stood, stoked the coals, and added a few logs to the hearth. Flames rose, casting a warm orange wash across the small cabin. He made coffee next strong, dark. No sugar, letting the smell fill the space like it always did. When the first streaks of pale gold crept across the frosted window, he heard movement in the bedroom, a soft creak, a hesitant breath, fabric rustling. Then the door opened. Marian stepped out quietly, wrapped in the flannel shirt he'd given her the night before. Her hair was still braided loosely down one shoulder, and though her eyes were swollen from tears, there was something steadier in her posture, like a person trying to rebuild themselves piece by piece. "Good morning," she said softly. Elias nodded. "Morning." She hesitated, glancing around the cabin as if still trying to understand the space she'd woken up in. He handed her a warm tin cup. "Coffee," he said. "It's strong. Might wake you faster than you want." She smiled gently, taking it in both hands. "I think strong is what I need." They sat across from each other at the table. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was almost comfortable, like two people learning how to occupy the same air without crowding one another. Marian sipped her coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle through her. "I didn't mean to trouble you last night," she said after a moment. "You were very kind to listen." "Wasn't trouble," Elias replied. "Some things are easier to say when Night's around." She nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose so." A soft quiet settled again before she spoke once more. "Did you sleep at all?" "A bit," he said. "Fire kept warm enough." Her brow creased with concern. "I'm sorry. You shouldn't have given me the bed. You needed it more," he said. "A roof and a warm place ain't doing much good if you can't offer 'em when needed." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch. Instead, she looked toward the window, where sunlight now reflected brightly across the untouched snow. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Pretty to look at," Elias said. "Harder to live in." She smiled faintly. "Seems like that describes more than just the snow." He didn't comment, though he wanted to. Instead, he stood and reached for his coat. "Storm cleared," he said. "Road to town ought to be passable by midday. If you want, I can take you back." The suggestion hung heavily in the air. Marian looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I'm ready to face everyone." "You don't have to," Elias said gently. "No rule says you need to hurry." She looked up, eyes searching his face. "I don't want to be in the way," she whispered. "You're not," he said, voice firm. Her shoulders eased slightly. "Just for today, then," she said. "I'd like to stay a little longer." He nodded. "You're welcome here." A warm silence followed, quiet but full. By mid-morning, the storm's aftermath glittered under a sun that felt brighter than usual. Elias showed Marian the small crates by the window where he kept winter supplies: beans, rice, dried herbs, potatoes stored low in a wooden bin. She listened attentively, absorbing the rhythm of this life with a kind of quiet curiosity. "Living alone out here," she said as she ran her hand lightly across a jar of dried sage, "must take a great amount of strength." Elias shrugged. "Takes more stubborn than strength, I guess." She smiled. "Stubborn can be a kind of strength, too." He didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. Later, they stepped outside together. Marian wrapped the blanket around her shoulders while Elias led her through the snow toward the corral. The air was crisp, the kind that stung the lungs but made everything feel cleaner. Bramble lifted his head at their approach, snorting softly. "He's beautiful," Marian said. "He's steady," Elias replied, rubbing the horse's neck. "Wouldn't call him beautiful, but reliable." "Reliable men are hard to find, too," she said quietly. The words hung between them. Elias didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to. Instead, he showed her where he kept hay in the small shed, how he broke the ice in the water trough when temperatures dropped too low, how he tracked prints along the ridge in case wolves wandered too near. Marian listened, her eyes tracing every movement. "You do all this alone?" she asked. "Always have. Doesn't it get lonely?" He paused, gripping the wooden edge of the trough a moment longer than necessary. "Most days." "You don't think about it," he said. "Some days. It's all you feel." Marian lowered her gaze. "I understand that more than I should." Their eyes met. Brief, quiet, but full. Back in the cabin, Marian helped with simple chores, folding blankets, sweeping snow from the doorway, rinsing the tin cups. Elias watched her move around the small kitchen, noticing the care she put into each task. "You don't have to do all that," he said. "I know," she replied softly, "but doing something helps." He understood. Keeping busy had saved him through many long winters. "You're welcome to whatever work you want to do," he said, "or you can rest." A small silence followed. Both possibilities were new to her. "I'd like to help," she said. "Feels easier when my hands are busy." Elias nodded, handing her a dish towel. "Dry these, then." The simple rhythm of shared tasks filled the room in a way he hadn't felt in years. The quiet wasn't empty. It was peaceful. And yet, beneath that peace, something stirred, something unsteady, something dangerous. He tried to ignore it. By afternoon, Marian stood at the small window overlooking the vast, snow-covered plain. Elias approached with caution, not wanting to intrude, but wanting to understand what lingered behind her thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She sighed softly, her breath fogging the cold glass. "That I don't know what happens next," she said. "That I don't know where I belong anymore." Elias leaned one shoulder against the wall beside her. "There's no shame in not knowing. Sometimes the land don't show its path until spring." She smiled faintly. "You speak like someone who's waded through a lot of winters." "I have." She looked up at him, then direct, vulnerable, steady. "It must have been very lonely, losing someone like that." Elias's throat tightened. He hadn't planned to talk about Claire, not today, not ever, if he could help it, but Marian's eyes held no intrusion, only understanding. "Some things you don't move past," he said quietly. "You just learn to walk with the weight." She nodded, tears pooling again, but these weren't the broken tears of the day before. They were softer, like thawed snow sliding off a rooftop. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for your loss." He nodded in return. "And I'm sorry for yours." Their losses were different, but the ache from them felt strangely the same. Two wounded lives, overlapping in a quiet cabin built for a family neither of them had any more. Marian looked down at her hands. "I don't want to be afraid of the world," she whispered, "but today made me feel so small." "You're not small," Elias said. "How do you know? Because you're still standing." She swallowed hard. "That's only because you helped me." Elias shook his head lightly. "No. You stood up on your own. All I did was offer a warmer place to do it." The fire snapped behind them, a spark leaping into the air. Marian breathed in deeply. "When the storm stopped this morning, I felt something settle inside me, like maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's the start of something I don't understand yet." Elias looked at her carefully. Her eyes were no longer lost. They were searching. "You don't need to understand it today," he said. Another soft silence. Then she turned toward him, closer this time, but still careful. "Elias, thank you," she said, "for giving me space to breathe." He nodded once, but inside, something trembled. He turned away before she could see it, because he knew as surely as the snow fell, that if he wasn't careful, he would start wanting things he had no right to want. And want had ruined him once already. As evening approached, Marian prepared biscuits from flour and lard she found in his pantry. The smell filled the cabin with a faint, comforting warmth. She set a plate before him, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I hope it's not terrible," she said. Elias took a bite. It was warm, simple, imperfect, and one of the best things he'd eaten in years. "It's good," he said. A small smile touched her lips. They ate quietly. Two people learning, slowly, what it felt like not to be alone. By the time the sun sank low behind the distant ridge, the snow had settled into a soft blue sheen across the plains. Evening came early in winter, and with it a stillness that wrapped the land in quiet. Elias stood by the door, pulling on his coat, preparing for a short ride into town to check on supplies and see whether the telegraph line had survived the storm. Marian watched him from by the fire, her hands folded gently in her lap. She had insisted on tidying the kitchen after supper, sweeping the floor, and washing the tin plates. Now she sat with a calm that looked new on her, a steadiness she had begun to reclaim. "Will it be a long trip?" she asked softly. "Half-hour each way if the path's clear?" Elias replied. "Bramble knows the road well. Just need to make sure Claridge didn't take too much of a beating during the storm." Marian nodded, though her fingers fidgeted slightly with the edge of her sleeve. Elias paused, noticing. "You'll be all right here," he said. "The fire's strong. Plenty of wood stacked inside, and I'll only be gone a bit." "I know," she said quickly, though she didn't sound fully convinced. "It's just that I haven't been alone since yesterday." He softened at that. "You're safe here," he said. "Storm's gone. Nothing near but snow and wind." She offered a small smile. "I suppose that should comfort me." "It will," he said. "In time." He buckled his coat, then hesitated, one hand resting on the doorknob. Something pressed at him, an instinct he couldn't ignore. "If you feel uneasy," he added, "you can sit on the porch for a bit. Sometimes hearing the land breathe helps calm the mind." She glanced toward the door, then back at him. "You really listen to the land, don't you? Always have," he said quietly. "Out here, it's the only thing that never lies." Her smile deepened, soft, appreciative. "Be careful," she whispered. He dipped his head, an unspoken promise, then stepped into the cold. Claridge sat tucked against the low ridge like a cluster of lanterns fighting off the night. Elias rode into town, the snow crunching beneath Bramble's hooves. A few townsfolk bustled between buildings, clearing paths or checking roofs for damage. Smoke drifted from chimneys, lamps glowed behind frosted windows. As Elias tied Bramble outside Jennings' general store, the door swung open and Martha Jennings bustled out, brushing snow from her apron. "Well, if it isn't Elias Carter," she exclaimed. "Thought that storm might have buried you alive out there." "Not this time," Elias said, stepping past her into the warm store. Martha shut the door behind him, then lowered her voice. "Now, what's this? I hear about you riding off last night with a woman in her wedding dress." Elias stiffened. Small towns had ears like wolves. They heard everything, even when they shouldn't. "She needed help," he said simply. Martha's eyes sparkled not in judgment but in curiosity. "And I suppose you're the only man in Wyoming who knows how to help a woman without causing gossip." "I didn't come for gossip," Elias replied. "No," she agreed, grabbing a tin of kerosene from the shelf. "You came for supplies. And yet, here you are, supplying half the town with something to whisper about." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "I did what was right, that's all." Martha paused, softening. "I know you did. Elias, no one doubts your character." Her expression gentled further. "But folks are worried about her. And curious. That's all. She's safe," he said firmly. "That's what matters." "Well," Martha said as she set the kerosene down, "safe is better than the alternative. But don't expect people to bite their tongues. You bring home a bride-shaped storm and the town is bound to notice." Elias ignored the tease. "How's the telegraph line snapped halfway to Sheridan?" "Won't be fixed for days." Martha sighed. "Means nobody's getting word to family or fiancés." Elias frowned at the last word. Martha caught the look. "Oh, don't worry, dear. No one expects Hollis Wren to come riding back like some storybook hero. He's no hero," Elias muttered. "Good thing Marian Ellis seems sharper than she feels right now." Martha added. Elias paused. "You talked to her after the ceremony yesterday. Poor thing was shaking like a leaf. You did right taking her somewhere warm." Elias shifted his weight. "I only offered her shelter." Martha gave him a pointed look. "Shelter can change a life. Elias, folks underestimate that." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Something in those words settled into him like a stone dropped into deep water. Before he left, Martha grabbed a small parcel from beneath the counter. "A few biscuits," she said. "For Marian. And don't argue she could use a bit of sweetness today." Elias took the parcel, his voice quiet. "Thank you. Tell her she's welcome here any time. And tell her I'm sorry she had to meet Wyoming on such a hard day." He nodded, then stepped back outside, the night colder than before. The ride home was darker. Clouds slipped slowly across the moon, dimming the pale light over the snow. Elias urged Bramble into a steady trot, wanting to return sooner than he cared to admit. He hadn't expected to worry. He hadn't expected to feel anything at all. But Marian's quiet voice from the night before lingered. "I haven't been alone since yesterday." And something about that had carved itself into him. When the cabin finally came into view, Elias felt a tension release just enough for him to breathe easier. Smoke curled from the chimney. Light flickered through the frosted window. All signs normal, but when he stepped onto the porch, boots thudding softly against the wooden planks. He saw Marian sitting there, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, knees tucked against her chest. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was simply waiting. She turned when she heard him, relief softening her face. "You're back," she said quietly. "I said I would be." She smiled faintly. "I know, but I suppose storms leave you with strange fears." He sat beside her, leaving space but not too much. The night was crisp, stars glittering faintly through breaks in the clouds. The land stretched vast around them, silent, endless. "Town doing all right?" she asked. "Mostly," Elias said. "Telegraph's down. Martha sent biscuits for you." Marian laughed softly. "Of course she did. She has that look like someone who feeds away other people's sadness." Elias's lips lifted slightly. "That's Martha." Marian turned toward him, studying his face in the moonlight. "And you," she said slowly. "You bring quiet." He blinked. "Quiet. Yes." She pulled the blanket tighter. Not silence that hurts, but silence that lets someone breathe. He didn't know what to say to that. Compliments were not things he carried easily. She looked back toward the dark horizon. "I used to think calm was something fragile," she said. "Something you earned only when life was kind. But now I wonder if it's something you build, like cabin walls, like fire on a cold morning." Elias rested his hands loosely in his lap. Calm's a choice, he said quietly. Same as fear. She nodded slowly. But choices feel harder after yesterday. He understood more than he wished to. What happened to you, he said, wasn't your doing. Maybe not, she answered, but it broke something inside me. He turned slightly toward her. Broken things can be mended. She looked down. Not always. No. Elias agreed. Not always, but you're already standing. That's the first step. A wind brushed the porch, carrying the faint smell of pine and frozen earth. Marian closed her eyes briefly, letting it wash over her. When I heard the wind earlier, she said, I thought it was someone riding up. My heart practically stopped. You're safe here, Elias repeated gently. Nothing's coming for you. She opened her eyes, meeting his. I believe you, she whispered. Something tightened in Elias's chest unexpected. Sharp and painfully alive. He cleared his throat. You should come inside. Cold'll settle in your bones if you stay out long. She hesitated. Would you sit with me just a little longer? The quiet. It feels different when you're here. He hesitated only a moment, then nodded. All right. They sat together in silence, not the hollow kind, but the warm kind, the kind that bridged two wounded worlds without forcing them to touch. After a while, Marian spoke again, her voice softer than the snow drifting off the roof. Elias, I don't know where I'm supposed to go after this. His jaw tightened. He had no right to hope, no right to want. Yet the words came before he could cage them. You don't need to know tonight. She looked at him carefully. Do you mind if I stay another day? No, he said quietly. You can stay as long as you need. Her expression softened, grateful. Relieved. Something more. And though Elias didn't move closer, something inside him did. A shift, a spark, a quiet stirring in the place he had buried warmth years ago. The night wrapped around them as she whispered, Thank you, Elias. He only nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon, because he knew somewhere deep that the real storm hadn't been the one that fell from the sky. It was the one rising inside him. The next morning broke with a thin veil of fog stretching across the plains, soft as breath against glass. The world outside the cabin looked muted, as if the land itself was trying to tread gently after the storm. Elias woke early again, though he'd slept more restlessly than usual. His mind had wandered too far in the night toward places he didn't allow himself to linger, toward a woman sleeping behind a wooden door. He rose, stirring the fire back to life. When the flames caught, warm light flickered across the cabin walls. He made coffee the same way he always did, strong, simple, no fuss. But today his hands were slower, as if he were trying not to wake the quiet around him. Marian emerged a short time later, wrapped in the flannel shirt and wool blanket. Her hair was still loose, waving softly around her shoulders. She looked calm, tired, but steadier, as if the night had given her back a few small pieces of herself. Good morning, Elias, she said softly. Mornin', he answered, handing her a cup of coffee. She smiled, just a gentle curve of her mouth, but real. They drank in silence for a moment, watching the fog drift past the window. Marian's eyes followed it with an almost reverent quiet. It feels different today, she murmured. What does the air, the light? Yesterday everything felt sharp. Today feels softer. Elias nodded slightly. Storms do that. They take the edge off things after they've torn through. Her gaze shifted toward him. Is that something you learned the hard way? His jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch away. Most lessons worth knowing don't come easy, he said. She nodded once, understanding without pressing further. After breakfast, Marian offered to help gather firewood. You'll need more with the cold coming back tonight, she reasoned. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to say she shouldn't strain herself, that she should rest, but there was a quiet determination in her expression he didn't want to take from her. So he handed her a pair of gloves and a scarf. They stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking into a fresh layer of untouched snow. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, but clear, crisp, alive. Elias led her to the woodpile beside the cabin. "I'll split," he said. "You can stack." She nodded, pulling the gloves tight around her wrists. He set a log on the chopping block and swung the axe with practiced ease. Wood split cleanly down the middle. Marian knelt to gather the pieces, stacking them neatly against the cabin wall. For a while, they worked without speaking. Chop, gather, stack. A shared rhythm forming in the cold morning light. After a few minutes, Marian paused, watching Elias as he swung the axe again. There was a strength in him that looked effortless, but not harsh, controlled, grounded. Every movement precise, driven by purpose rather than force. "You make it look easy," she said. He shook his head. "Ain't easy. Just familiar." She smiled faintly. Familiar can be comforting. He looked at her meaningfully. Not always. Her eyes held his for a heartbeat long enough to say without words that she understood. Then she bent to gather another piece of wood. When the pile was finally stacked high, Elias wiped his brow with the back of his glove. "That's enough for now," he said. "You did good work." Marian glanced at the neatly aligned wood, her breath fogging in the air. "It feels good," she admitted, "to do something with my hands again. Something real." "You're handy with more than books and fancy dresses," he noted. A soft laugh escaped her, small but genuine. "I grew up doing chores, same as anyone. My mother always said work makes the world steady." "Smart woman," Elias said. "She was," Marian replied softly. "Very." Her voice trembled slightly at the memory, but she steadied herself with a breath. "Thank you for letting me help." "You don't need permission to do what you want," Elias said. "This place ain't a prison." She nodded slowly. "I know. It just feels good to be useful." He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of distant crunching snow cut him off. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the direction of town. Marian stiffened immediately, her hands curling around the blanket draped over her shoulders. "Elias, stay by the porch," he murmured. His voice changed soft, but sharp with alertness. He stepped forward, eyes narrowing toward the ridge that overlooked the cabin. For a moment, all he saw was snow and light. Then a figure emerged through the fog, a stocky shape in a heavy brown coat. Hat pulled low, boots sinking deep into the drifts. Not riding, walking. Elias's pulse sharpened. Most men didn't walk out here unless they had a reason. A heavy reason. As the figure drew closer, Elias recognized him. Sheriff Amos Grant, beard frosted with snow, expression hard to read. "Morning, Elias," Amos called, voice carrying low across the cold. "Sheriff," Elias answered cautiously. "Something wrong." Amos's gaze shifted toward Marian before returning to Elias. "We need to talk." Elias felt Marian step closer behind him, instinctively seeking protection. He stayed still, rooted, calm but alert. "What's the matter?" Elias asked. Amos exhaled a long plume of breath. "There's been trouble in town," he said. "Trouble you ought to hear." Elias braced, spit it out. Amos looked at Marian again, longer this time, as if weighing how much she could bear. "It's about Hollis Wren." Marian's breath hitched sharply. Elias felt her hand brush the back of his arm, not seeking to cling, but steady herself. "What about him?" Elias asked, keeping his voice level. Amos rubbed his beard. "He's back in Clayridge." Marian staggered a half step, catching herself on the porch railing. What she whispered. Elias stepped slightly in front of her without thinking. Not touching her, never touching without her consent, but positioning himself so she didn't have to face the words alone. Amos continued. He rode in this morning. Says he wants to see her. Marian's face drained of color. Elias's jaw clenched. He say what for? Elias asked. Voice tight. He claims he made a mistake, Amos said. Says he panicked. Says he wants to set things right. Elias let out a slow, bitter breath through his nose. Marian shook her head, voice barely a whisper. No. He left me there. He left me standing alone. Elias turned slightly, meeting her eyes. You don't owe him anything. But Amos didn't pause. That ain't the only part, the sheriff said quietly. Elias stiffened. What else? Amos lowered his voice, making sure Marian didn't have to hear more pain than necessary, but she heard anyway. Hollis came in with a bruise on his face and a story about being jumped outside Sheridan. Says some men threatened him. Says he panicked and ran. Marian's hands trembled. I don't believe it, she whispered. He lies when he's cornered. Elias nodded once. He's trying to save face. Amos shifted uncomfortably. Maybe, but that ain't the real reason I came. Elias's eyes narrowed. Then why? The sheriff looked between them, Elias, steady as a mountain, and Marian, fragile but standing straight despite the tremor in her hands. Hollis says he's coming out here, Amos said quietly. Says he wants to bring her back. Marian's breath caught, sharp and pained. Elias felt something primal tighten inside him, protective, fierce, unyielding. He's not setting foot on my land, Elias said, his voice low, cold, final. Amos nodded. I figured you'd say that. I told him to wait until I brought word. Marian looked at the sheriff, her eyes shining with fear and fury. I won't go with him, she said. Not after what he did. You don't have to, Amos replied gently. No law says you do. Elias turned fully toward Marian now, voice steady as bedrock. You hear that you don't go anywhere you don't want to. She nodded shakily. Amos tugged his gloves tighter. I'll head back to town. I'll stall him. But be careful. He's determined. And men like that, cornered, ashamed they do foolish things. Elias nodded once. When the sheriff walked away, his figure shrinking into the fog, Marian turned toward Elias, breathing unsteady. He can't make me go, she whispered. No, Elias said firmly. No one can. Her eyes searched his not for answers, but for something to anchor her to the ground. Elias. I'm scared. He didn't touch her, didn't cross that line. But his voice held all the steadiness she needed. I won't let anything happen to you. Her breath shook out, not because she doubted him, but because she believed him. And that belief terrified her more than Hollis ever could. For a long moment after the sheriff disappeared into the fog, neither Elias nor Marian moved. The snow muted everything, the wind, their breathing, even the thud of Elias's heart, which had begun pounding with a quiet, simmering intensity he hadn't felt in years. Marian stood beside him on the porch, clutching the wool blanket around her as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes stayed fixed on the white horizon where Amos's figure had vanished, as though Hollis Wren might materialize from that same fog any second. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I knew he would come back someday, she whispered. I just didn't think it would be this soon, or this way. Elias exhaled slowly, grounding himself before he answered. People like Hollis don't return out of love, he said. They come back for the sake of their pride. Marian closed her eyes. That's what frightens me. Elias wanted to tell her she didn't need to be afraid, wanted to reach for her hand, pull her from the cold, promise things he had no right to promise. But he kept still, because he wasn't a man who moved on impulse, and because the fragility in her eyes demanded steadiness, not comfort. "Let's go inside," he said gently. Cold set in deep. She nodded, though her legs trembled slightly as she stepped into the warmth of the cabin. Elias shut the door behind them, listening as the lock clicked into place. He stoked the fire, adding a fresh log until flames licked upward with renewed heat. Marian stood near the table, her hands pressed flat against its surface to steady herself. For a while, neither spoke. Then Marian's breath shuddered out. "He can't force me to return with him." "Can he?" Elias turned to face her fully. "No," he said, calm and absolute. "He can't. Sheriff made that clear. But Hollis—" Her voice tightened. "He doesn't hear no. Not when he thinks he's owed something." "Owed," Elias repeated, a quiet anger sparking behind his words. "You don't owe that man anything." She looked away, her throat working. People don't see it that way. They see a man who had a change of heart, who rode all the way back to claim what he left behind. Elias stepped closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "Marian, you're not something to be claimed." Her breath hitched. No one had ever said it to her like that, clear, steady, without hesitation. She swallowed hard, blinking away the sudden burn behind her eyes. "He'll twist things," she whispered. "That's what he does. He'll make the town believe that he was confused, overwhelmed, frightened, that he made a mistake in the moment, and people will believe him. Elias, they always do." Elias's voice turned low and firm. "Clayridge ain't a perfect town, but it's a fair one. Folks there judge by action, not excuses." She met his eyes with a trembling sort of vulnerability. "And what do you think Hollis wants?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He took a slow breath, weighing his words. "I think," he said quietly, "he wants to fix his reputation, not your heart." A tear escaped down Marian's cheek before she could stop it. She brushed it away quickly, frustrated by her own emotion. "I'm tired of being something he uses to make himself look better," she whispered. Elias's chest tightened, not with pity, but with something far deeper, something that stirred like thawing earth beneath winter frost. "You're not that now," he said. "Not here." She looked at him a long, searching look that warmed and unsettled him all at once. Then her strength faltered, and she sank slowly into the nearest chair. Elias moved toward her, not touching, but anchoring her with his presence. After a long moment, she drew a steadying breath. "What? What should I do?" she asked softly. Elias lowered himself into the seat across from her. He didn't answer quickly, because this choice wasn't his to make, and he respected her too much to pretend otherwise. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said gently. "Let the dust settle. Let Hollis talk to the sheriff. Let the town whisper. None of that changes who you are or what you want, but I don't know what I want anymore," she whispered. "That's all right," Elias said. "You'll know when you're ready." A silence followed, quiet, warm, fragile. Then, unexpectedly, Marian let out a humorless laugh. "Funny," she said. "I came all this way for a future with a man who didn't want me, and now I'm sitting here in the home of someone who barely knows me, and yet I feel more seen than I have in years." Elias's throat tightened. He forced himself to look down at the worn wooden table, as though the grain held answers. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you see a person clearer when they're hurting." "And what do you see?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but there was something in it, a plea, a need for truth, no matter how small. Elias looked up, meeting her eyes fully. "I see a woman who's stronger than she knows," he said. "Someone who deserves gentleness and hasn't been given enough of it." The room stilled. The fire cracked softly, as if punctuating his words. Marian inhaled sharply, her gaze shimmering. For a moment, Elias feared he had said too much, revealed too much. But she didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Her voice came out steady. "Thank you." He nodded once, trying to ground himself again. The rest of the morning passed in a delicate, almost suspended quiet. Marian helped with simple tasks, folding linens, brushing dust from shelves, sorting jars in the pantry. Elias chopped more wood, repaired a loose hinge on the back door, swept snow from the porch. It was ordinary work, gentle work, and the cabin somehow felt fuller for it, but while his hands remained busy, Elias's mind churned. Hollis Wren, a man he hadn't met but already mistrusted down to his bones. A man who abandoned a woman at the altar and thought he could return with a story neat enough to erase the shame. It stirred memories of another winter long ago, one where Elias had been too late to save the two people who mattered most to him. He clenched his jaw, striking the woodpile harder. He wouldn't be too late this time. Not for Marian. Not for anyone under his roof. When afternoon settled into early dusk, Marian stepped outside, breathing in the icy air. Elias watched her from a few paces behind, noticing how the cold pinked her cheeks and how she wrapped the blanket tighter with each breath. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders softened. "I know," she whispered, "but fear isn't something you just put down." "No." Elias agreed, "but you don't carry it alone. This time." She did turn toward him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "All of this. Helping me, protecting me, telling me truths no one else ever has." His breath frosted in the air between them. "Because I want to. Because I can't stand the thought of you hurting. Because you walked into my life like a quiet storm and now I can't imagine the cabin without you in it." He didn't say any of that. Instead, he answered the only way he could with truth wrapped in restraint. "Because you deserve better than what you were given," he said quietly. "And because a person shouldn't face a storm alone." For a heartbeat, Marian didn't move. Then she stepped forward, just enough to close half the distance between them. "I feel safe here," she whispered. "Safer than I have in years." Elias swallowed hard. "That's how it should be," he said. "Safe enough to breathe, safe enough to think." A gust of wind brushed past them, scattering loose snow along the porch. Marian shivered slightly, but she didn't step back. "Will Hollis come today?" she asked. Elias shook his head, not with Amos watching him, but soon. He won't wait long. Fear flickered in her eyes. Elias steadied his voice. "When he comes, I'll be here." Marian's breath caught. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, his voice low and steady. "You're not alone, Marian. Not anymore." But later, after dusk settled and Marian rested by the fire with a book from Elias's small shelf, he stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The sky was darkening, clouds drifting low. The smell of cold pine filled the air. Snow squeaked beneath his boots as he paced once along the porch. He needed the cold, needed the space, because inside, he felt something shifting, a dangerous warmth rising beneath all the walls he had spent years building. He leaned his hands against the railing, staring at the white horizon. "This is trouble. Carter," he muttered to himself. "Real trouble?" But even as he said it, he knew something with absolute clarity. He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not when Marian Ellis had chosen to stay another day. Not when she trusted him enough to breathe easier under his roof. And not when Hollis Wren, a man who hadn't earned a single breath of that trust, was walking back into the picture. Elias straightened, the cold sharpening every sense. The past had taken too much from him. He wouldn't let it take her too, not while he still drew breath. The following day came with a brittle kind of cold, the kind that made the horizon crackle like glass under sunlight. Frost clung to the window panes of the cabin, and small crystals gathered along the wooden beams inside, glowing faintly in the early light. Marian woke early, though she didn't rise right away. She lay quietly in the small bed, listening to the rhythmic sounds of Elias tending to the hearth. There was something grounding in it, his steady movements, the low scrape of wood against metal, the soft exhale as the fire caught. It reminded her of mornings long before Clayridge, back when life had felt simpler, even if it hadn't truly been. When she finally stepped out of the room, Elias looked up with a quiet nod. "Morning." "Good morning," she answered, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He handed her a warm tin cup of coffee. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep through her fingers. They didn't speak for several minutes, letting the morning ease into being. Marian felt a strange sense of peace sitting across from him, the kind of peace that made her feel both braver and more vulnerable. But that peace, as fragile as it was, cracked with the sound of approaching hooves. Elias's head lifted immediately. Marian's breath froze in her chest. Elias set his cup down slowly, eyes hardening. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Marian grabbed the table's edge. "Elias, is it him?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. He strode toward the door, pulling on his coat in one smooth motion. Before stepping outside, he paused, turning back toward her. "No matter what he says, you don't have to speak to him unless you want to." She nodded shakily. "All right." His gaze held hers for a moment steady, reassuring, and then he stepped outside. Elias closed the cabin door behind him, the cold air slicing across his face like a blade. He stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching against hard-packed snow. Hollis Wren sat on a bay gelding a few yards away, posture stiff and uncertain. His face was pinched from the cold, or perhaps from something deeper. His coat looked expensive, though travel-worn now, and a dark bruise still shadowed his left cheekbone. "Morning, Carter," Hollis said, trying for steadiness. Elias didn't return the greeting. His voice came out low and even. "You're not welcome here." Hollis shifted in the saddle. "I didn't come for you." "No," Elias replied. "You came for her, but she doesn't owe you a minute." Hollis blew out a harsh breath, frustration edging his words. "Sheriff said I should talk to her. He said she deserves to hear me out. He said she can choose." Elias corrected. "Not that she's required." Hollis's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the cabin, eyes flicking over the windows. "Is she inside?" Elias stepped down from the porch, placing himself squarely between Hollis and the cabin. "Doesn't matter where she is. You're speaking to me right now." Hollis bristled. "You think you've got some claim on her, Nody?" Elias said calmly. "But I've got responsibility for anyone under my roof, and that includes keeping trouble away." Hollis drew in a sharp breath, anger sparking. "Trouble. You think I came here to hurt her?" "I think you came here for yourself," Elias replied. "To fix the mess you made, to patch your pride." Hollis flinched, eyes narrowing. "You know nothing about me." Elias didn't blink. "I know enough." A tense silence stretched between them. Hollis shifted again, gripping the reins tightly. "Finally," he said, voice strained. "I made mistakes, Carter. I know that. But I came back to make them right." Elias's voice lowered. "You left her standing in a church full of people. You left her humiliated, alone. You don't get to fix that with an apology you rehearsed on the ride here." Hollis swallowed hard. "I panicked. I was jumped outside Sheridan, and that's the second time you've told that story." Elias cut in, "And it don't sound any truer now." Hollis's gaze flickered fear or guilt. Elias couldn't tell. Elias stepped closer. Here's the truth. Wren, Marian doesn't need more pain. And if you push her into another corner she didn't choose, you'll only prove why she's better off without you." The words hit harder than a fist. Hollis jerked the reins, the horse sidestepping. "You don't speak for her," he spat. "No," Elias replied, steady as stone. "But I'll stand between you and anything that hurts her, and that includes you." Hollis stared, breathing harshly, anger slowly shifting into something weaker: doubt, shame, realization. Then the cabin door opened. Marian stepped onto the porch, wrapped in Elias's flannel shirt and blanket, but standing straighter than she had in days. Hollis froze. "Marian." He breathed. She didn't step forward. She didn't run to him. She simply stood there, her fingers gripping the blanket, her eyes steady despite the tremor in her breath. "Hollis," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Why are you here?" Hollis opened his mouth, then closed it again. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I came back for you." Marian inhaled, pain flickering across her features before she steadied herself. "You came back for yourself," she corrected softly. "Not for me." Hollis swallowed. "That's not true, isn't it?" she asked gently, but firmly. "You left me alone in front of everyone. Hollis, you walked away from the life I uprooted everything to build. You didn't just break my heart, you broke my trust." Hollis sagged in the saddle, shoulders slumping. "I know. And I'm sorry. Truly." Marian's eyes filled, but her voice didn't quaver. "I wanted to believe in you. I wanted to build a home with you. But you left me when the world was watching. And if a man leaves once, he'll leave again." Hollis flinched. Marian stepped forward, not toward him, but to stand beside Elias's shoulder, where she felt steady. "I don't belong with someone who runs from storms," she said softly. "Not anymore." Her hand brushed the blanket at her chest, gripping it tightly. "And I'm not going back with you." Hollis's eyes widened in disbelief. "Marian, please, I can do better. We can fix this." She shook her head. "No, Hollis, you can fix your reputation, but not what you broke in me." A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't hide it. Hollis's face fell. He looked at her, then at Elias, anger flaring again. "This is because of him, isn't it?" He snapped. "You ran into the arms of the first man who Elias cut him off." Voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Watch your tongue." Marian shook her head. "No. Elias didn't make my choice." "You did?" Hollis stared at her for a long moment, his face twisting with bewilderment and wounded pride. Then, without another word, he jerked the reins and turned the horse sharply. Snow sprayed behind him as he rode away, fading into the fog from which he'd come. Marian watched until he disappeared completely. Only then did her shoulders collapse. Elias remained beside her, not touching, but present, waiting for her to breathe again. "You did right," he said softly. Marian shook her head as tears fell freely. "It didn't feel right, but it felt necessary." She whispered, "And that scares me." Elias exhaled, slow and grounded. "Necessary things usually do." She turned toward him, searching his face with trembling vulnerability. "Elias, what happens now?" His voice softened to something almost dangerous. "Now," he said, "now you heal, one step at a time, and you do it in your own way, on your own terms. And you," she whispered, "where will you be, his breath frosted in the cold between them?" "Wherever you need," he said quietly. Her eyes shimmered not with fear this time, but with something warmer. For the first time in a very long time, Marian Ellis didn't feel abandoned. She felt chosen. Snow kept falling long after Hollis Wren disappeared beyond the ridge, each flake drifting in slow spirals as if hesitant to land. The world felt muted, softened, almost reverent, as though nature itself recognized the weight of what had just taken place. Marian stood there a while longer, blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the direction Hollis had gone, not because she doubted her choice, but because choices of that size always carried echoes. Even when they were right, even when they were necessary. Elias didn't rush her. He just stayed beside her, steady as a fence post driven deep into winter ground. Only when Marian let out a quivering breath, the kind that left a person empty and free all at once, did Elias speak. "You want to go inside?" His voice was low, respectful. Marian hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Please." He opened the door for her. She slipped inside, moving with the slow, fragile steps of someone who'd laid down a burden too heavy to carry, but not yet learned how to walk without it. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a gentle hand. Marian moved toward the table and sat, palms resting flat against the wood. She didn't cry, not anymore. There were tears earlier. Yes. But now there was only silence. A silence so deep it felt like a clean space inside her, cleared out for something new. Elias hung up his coat near the door, shaking off the snow, then approached. "You want some tea?" he asked quietly. She nodded without looking up. He filled a pot, set it on the stove, and kept his movements calm, slow enough that she didn't feel hurried, but sure enough that she knew she wasn't alone. When he finally set the warm mug in front of her, Marian curled her hands around it and closed her eyes. For a long time. Neither spoke. Then Marian whispered. "I didn't think he would take no so quickly." Elias pulled out the chair across from her, but didn't sit yet. He didn't take it quickly. He said, he took it hard. She opened her eyes, meeting his. You could tell he nodded. Pride bruises louder than bone. Her lips trembled into a small, sad smile. "I'm not proud of how I felt watching him leave," she said. "It hurt, and yet I also felt relieved." "Relief ain't something to be ashamed of," Elias said gently. "It's a sign that your heart finally heard itself." She looked down at her hands, which tightened slightly around the mug. "I spent so many months believing we were building something. But today, when he spoke, when he reached for explanations, I realized I'd been carrying more hope than truth." Elias's eyes softened. "Happens to good people. Happens to people who love with trust." She breathed in shakily. "And you?" she asked. "Has it happened to you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he finally sat across from her, his broad shoulders framed by the firelight behind him. "Yes," he said simply. "It has." She waited, sensing more beneath the surface. But Elias didn't offer details, and she didn't push. His past was something he shared in pieces, slowly, deliberately, like a man sifting through stones to find the ones worth keeping. After a moment, Marian whispered, "I'm not sure what comes next." Elias studied her face. "You don't need to know today, but I feel like I should," she said. "Like people will expect something. Expect me to go somewhere, be someone, decide my next step. People expect too much," Elias replied. "Let them talk. Let them wonder. You're the one who lives with the choices, not them." She exhaled, tension loosening just a fraction. "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you expect anything from me?" Elias shook his head. "No, not a thing." But his voice carried something else, something warm, something he wasn't ready to name. That afternoon, Marian rested by the fire, gradually settling into a light, much-needed sleep. Elias moved through the cabin quietly. Pausing occasionally to glance at her, her hand relaxed near her cheek, her breathing calm for the first time since she'd arrived. He stepped outside to bring in more wood. As he chopped, his mind churned not with fear or doubt, but with a strange new clarity. He wasn't falling for Marian Ellis because she needed saving. He was drawn to her because she'd saved herself. And that truth, quiet as it was, hit him harder than any winter wind. Hours passed. The sun dipped behind the pines. The snow eased into a light, drifting curtain. By late afternoon, Marian woke with a soft start, as though pulling herself back from a deep place. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair behind her ear. Elias looked over from the stove where he was stirring a pot of venison stew. "You rested well, I think so," she said. "I haven't slept like that in a long time." "That's good," Elias murmured. "Your body finally let go a little." She watched him quietly for a moment, his steady hands, his calm manner, the way he filled the small cabin without trying to. It felt safe watching him. It felt grounding. "Elias," she said softly. He looked over. "Yeah, can we talk about something? Something I've been afraid to say." He set the ladle down and turned fully toward her. "You can tell me anything." Marian hesitated, then drew in a breath, steadying herself. "When Hollis came back, I thought I would feel torn. I thought I would feel guilty, but instead, I felt something I didn't expect." "What's that?" Elias asked, his voice low. "I felt done," she whispered. "Not angry, not heartbroken, just done." Elias nodded slowly. "That's how you know a chapter's ended. Clean. Quiet." Tears shimmered along her lashes, soft, not painful. "I thought love was supposed to be loud," she said. "But maybe the right kind is quiet. Maybe it doesn't shout, it shows." Elias swallowed hard. His next words were careful, gentle. Quiet things last longer. Marian looked into his eyes, then really looked, and something warm unfurled in the space between them. A beginning. A shift. A spark neither wanted to name too soon. Evening settled in softly. Elias ladled stew into bowls. Marian helped slice bread and set the table, their movements falling into easy rhythm, as though they'd done it for years rather than days. They ate quietly at first, savoring the warmth of the meal. Then Marian set her spoon down. "Elias, would you take me back to Claridge tomorrow?" He looked up sharply. "You sure that's what you want after today?" She nodded slowly. "I need to face them. The whispers, the looks. If I don't go now, I'll always wonder if I was running." Elias respected that. "All right," he said. "We'll go. Together." Her lips parted slightly in relief. "But," she added softly, "after Claridge, I would like to come back here. If that's all right." Elias froze, not visibly, but she could feel the silence shift. "Marian." His voice was low, thick, careful. "This is your cabin now, too," she whispered, surprising them both with the steadiness of her voice. "At least, for as long as you'll have me." He set his spoon down with deliberate calm. "I'll have you here as long as you want to stay." The air thickened with something deeper than gratitude, warmer than comfort, something that felt like the early roots of belonging. Later that night, Marian stepped outside the cabin. The sky was clear, stars scattered like handfuls of silver dust across a vast black canvas. Her breath rose and faded in soft clouds. Elias followed a moment later, standing beside her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm thinking about how different my life looks now," she said. "I thought the altar was the end of everything, but maybe it was the start of something better." Elias looked at her, then really looked, his breath catching slightly in the cold. "I think so too," he said softly. A long, quiet pause. Then Marian turned to him with a small, trembling smile. You said once that a person shouldn't face a storm alone, she whispered. Maybe. Maybe the calm shouldn't be faced alone either. Elias's breath caught. Marian. Her eyes met his steady, brave, full of something growing stronger by the hour. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. Not yet. He exhaled, warm breath curling into the night air. I will, he said. When the time's right, I will. She nodded, stepping just a little closer. I'll be here, she whispered, when you're ready. The snow fell softly around them. The night held its breath, and though neither spoke another word, something quiet and steady settled into place between them. A promise, unspoken, but unmistakably real. Morning came quietly, on soft feet, as if it understood the day ahead would require gentleness. Frost clung to the cabin windows in thin white lace, and a hush settled over the pines surrounding Elias Carter's homestead. Marian Ellis stood near the hearth, fastening the last button on her coat with steady hands that trembled only slightly. Elias watched her from the doorway, his own coat slung over his arm. You ready? He asked softly. She nodded, though her breath wavered. As ready as I'll ever be. He didn't push. He just stepped forward and handed her a pair of wool gloves he'd placed by the stove to warm. She slipped them on, grateful for the heat, grateful for the quiet reassurance of the man standing before her. Thank you, she said. For what? Elias asked. For staying, she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, then answered simply, wouldn't be anywhere else. They saddled Elias's bay horse, Flint, and Marian climbed onto the wagon bench while Elias took the reins. The path to Claridge wound through snow-laden pines and across a frozen creek that whispered beneath the ice. The world was silent except for the rhythmic clop of hooves and the steady creak of wagon wheels. Marian watched the landscape pass, her thoughts swirling like the cold breath of winter around them. Elias, she began quietly. Do you think people will believe him? Elias's jaw shifted, slightly barely noticeable, but she'd learned to read the subtle tension in him. They'll believe whatever fits their version of the story, he said. Some folks will think he came back out of devotion. Others will say he came back out of guilt. And what do you think she asked? Elias didn't look at her, but his voice softened. I think a man shows his truth by what he does, not what he claims. And Hollis came back too late and with too little honesty. She absorbed his words slowly. It surprised her how much his opinion mattered, how much steadier she felt when he spoke. And what about me, she whispered. What will they think of my choice? Elias guided the reins gently as the wagon crossed a small rise. They'll think what they want, he said, but you know your truth. That's the only thing that matters. Her breath steadied. He always did that reached the heart of things without trying to direct her, without making the choice for her, just offering clarity she hadn't been able to see on her own. She turned her face toward the wind, letting the cold bite her cheeks. It woke her. It strengthened her. Today she wasn't going back to Claridge as a woman abandoned. She was returning as a woman who refused to stay broken. Claridge appeared gradually through the trees, small cabins clustered together, smoke curling from chimneys, horses tied to posts near the general store. As the wagon rolled into town, a few heads turned, then a few more. Whispers drifted like thin smoke on cold air. That's her. She's with Elias Carter. Thought she'd gone with Hollis. She turned Hollis away. Sheriff said so. Elias's hands tightened slightly on the reins, though his face remained calm. Marian straightened her spine, drawing a steady breath. She had expected whispers, but the sting of them was something else entirely. Martha Jennings stepped out of the general store the moment she saw Marian. Oh, honey, she said, bustling toward her. Thank heavens you're all right. Marian blinked in surprise, warmth blooming unexpectedly at the older woman's concern. "I'm fine, Martha," she said gently. "Truly." Martha glanced between Marian and Elias, her expression shifting into something curious and perhaps knowing. "Well," she said with an approving nod, "you're in good company." Elias cleared his throat. "Just making sure she got here safe." Martha raised a brow. Marian couldn't help the faint color rising to her cheeks. Before Martha could ask more, Sheriff Amos Grant walked up, dusting snow from his coat. "Morning," he said. "You two ready?" Marian swallowed. "Ready for what folks'll want to hear your side," Amos said. "Best they hear the truth straight from you." Marian stiffened. "I don't want to speak in front of everyone." "You don't have to," Elias said quietly. He stepped closer, not touching her, but the nearness steadied her like a firm hand on her back. "You talk to who you choose, nobody else." Amos nodded. "He's right. I'll keep things orderly." A few townspeople began to gather nearby Mrs. Whitcomb, old Henry Barrett, Clara Hodge with her shawl bundled under her chin. No malice in their faces, just curiosity tinged with concern. Marian drew a slow breath. "I'll speak," she said, "but only once, and only what's necessary." Elias's eyes warmed with quiet respect. They gathered by the wagon. The cold pressed around them, but Marian stood tall. Elias remained beside her, not shielding, not speaking for her, simply present. "Thank you," Marian began. Her voice carried, though soft. "I know there's been talk, and you deserve to hear the truth." The crowd leaned in. "Hollis Wren returned yesterday," she said. "He asked me to go back with him, but I refused." Clara Hodge frowned. "Why, dear, he came clear across the territory." "Because," Marian said, "a man who leaves a woman at the altar will leave her again when things grow difficult. I won't bind my life to someone who breaks his word." A murmur rippled through the crowd agreement, surprise, even admiration. Marian lifted her chin slightly. "And I didn't decide this out of anger or shame. I decided it out of clarity." She looked down at her gloved hands, then back at the people before her. "I know what I deserve now, and I know what I will not accept." Silence fell clean, respectful. Even Amos looked moved. Martha Jennings sniffed loudly. "Well said, child." Marian released a slow breath. It felt like laying a stone down one she'd carried for months without realizing how heavy it truly was. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm and grounding. That's all she has to say. And the townsfolk, sensing the line he drew, nodded and drifted back to their errands, their curiosity satisfied, their respect for Marian quietly renewed. When the crowd dispersed, Marian stepped aside, leaning against the hitching post as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. Elias approached slowly. "You all right?" She nodded, though her breath trembled. "Yes, I think so." "You did good," he said. "Better than most could have." She looked up at him, her eyes soft but steady. "I wouldn't have found my footing without you." Elias shook his head. "You found your footing on your own? I just walked beside you." Her chest ached not with sadness, but with something warmer, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something safe. "Elias, what happens now?" she asked quietly. He took a slow breath, visible in the cold air. Now he echoed. "Now you decide where you want to be?" She hesitated, heart tightening with a mixture of vulnerability and hope. "And if I choose to go back to your cabin," she whispered. The look that crossed Elias's face was subtle but unmistakable surprise, warmth, a flicker of something deeper. "If that's where you feel right," he said softly, "then that's where we'll go." Marian's breath caught. He hadn't said want. He had said feel right. And somehow, that meant more. She stepped closer just a half step and lowered her voice. "It is where I feel right," she whispered. Elias's breath stilled, and for the first time, something like hope, quiet, stubborn, undeniable rose between them like a slow flame. They prepared to climb onto the wagon when Sheriff Amos approached again. "One more thing," he said, pulling his coat tighter. Hollis left town early this morning, headed east. Marian exhaled, shoulders easing. "He won't trouble you again," Amos added gently. "Not after yesterday." Elias nodded. Good. Amos gave a faint, knowing smile as he turned to leave. "You two take care. Seems like you've weathered more than winter this week." Elias and Marian exchanged a glance. He wasn't wrong. 14. As they rolled out of Clayridge, the cold air bit sharp and clean, but Marian felt lighter than she had in months. Lighter, even, than she had been back in Boston before everything unraveled. And Elias, he kept glancing at her, small, almost unconscious glances, as if making sure she was still beside him. She was, and she would be. For the first time since her father died, since Hollis left her at the altar, since the long road west began, Marian Ellis felt her life opening, not closing, not ending, beginning. The road back to Elias Carter's homestead stretched long and white beneath the afternoon sun. Snow glimmered across the open land like powdered glass, unbroken except for the wagon tracks behind them and the soft prints of Flint's hooves ahead. The air carried a crispness that seemed to peel back the last doubts clinging to Marian's heart. Elias held the reins loosely, his posture relaxed but attentive. Marian sat beside him, gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze drifting over the winter landscape. For a while, they rode in silence, a good silence, a healing silence. Then Marian drew in a breath, steady but thoughtful. "Elias, may I ask something?" He glanced at her, brows easing. "You can ask anything." She hesitated not out of fear, but out of the weight of choosing the right words. "Earlier, in town. When you stood beside me," she paused, searching. "You didn't speak for me, but you were there. That meant more than you know." Elias didn't speak right away. The wind carried the faint scent of pine between them. "I figured," he said slowly, "that you spent enough time with folks trying to decide things for you. Didn't seem right to add my voice to that." Her breath softened. "You don't push, you don't demand, you just steady." He gave a small shrug, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Guess steady's all I know." Marian looked at him for a moment, really looked, the strong line of his jaw dusted with cold, the steady control in the way he held the reins, the quiet strength radiating from him. "Steady," she whispered, "is more than enough." A light breeze swept over the plain, brushing Marian's cheek. She tucked a loose strand of hair beneath her scarf. "You've lived alone a long time," she said gently. "6 winters." Elias answered. "Too many. Probably." Why, she asked. He didn't stiffen, he expected the question. But he didn't rush the answer either. "After my wife passed." He paused, breath fogging in the air. "People kept telling me to start again. Move on. Join town life. But I couldn't see past the grief for a long while. And after that, well, quiet got familiar." Marian's expression softened with understanding. "Quiet can be safe," she said softly, "but it can also be lonely." Elias nodded. "It was, still is sometimes." Now she asked gently. He didn't look at her, but his voice changed low and careful, like a man handling something fragile. "Now's different." Her breath hitched before she steadied it. "How so?" she whispered. He didn't answer immediately. His silence wasn't hesitation, but consideration. "Because," he said finally, "the cabin feels warmer with you in it, feels lived in, not just occupied." Her cheeks flushed with a quiet warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Elias," she whispered, but he cut her off softly. "You don't need to say anything. I'm not asking for anything. Just telling you the truth." She held his gaze then, letting the truth land between them like fresh snow, soft, quiet, undeniable. "I'm glad to be there," she whispered. "More than I expected." He breathed out slowly, almost like relief. Hours passed gently. They spoke about small things, the creek he planned to widen in spring, the neighbor's lost mule, the old cottonwood tree near the ridge that lightning split 3 summers back. But beneath their words lay something deeper, something like 2 rivers drifting closer. As the sun sank lower, casting pink and gold across the snow, Marian tugged her coat tighter. "Elias," she said softly. What if Hollis comes back? What if he decides he's not done?" Elias's hands tightened around the reins barely, but she noticed. "Then he'll speak to me," he said simply, "and I'll make sure he understands the word no better the second time." It wasn't a threat, just quiet promise wrapped in steel. Marian let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "And what if the town starts whispering again?" she asked. "About me staying with you. About us." Elias's jaw shifted, but not with discomfort, more with resolve. "Town can whisper all it wants, all it. Folks do that when they don't know the whole story. And when they think they do," she asked, "then they talk louder," he said with a small, wry smile. "But truth's still truth, even when noise tries to drown it." She smiled faintly. "And what is the truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, really looked, then answered quietly, "That you're safe with me, and welcome, and free to leave or stay as you choose. That's the only truth that matters." It settled deep in her chest, solid, warm, grounding. As they crested the last ridge before his homestead, the cabin came into view. Smoke drifted from the chimney. The barn stood half-wrapped in snow, and the fence line glimmered under the sun's fading light. Marian felt something loosen inside her. "This feels like home," she said softly. Elias's breath stopped for the briefest moment before he guided the wagon down the slope. "You're welcome to make it yours," he said, "whatever that looks like. For however long." A gentle quiet settled between them. Not assumption, not pressure, just possibility. When they reached the cabin, Elias tied the horse and helped Marian down from the wagon. She stepped onto the snow-packed ground, inhaling the clean winter air. Elias watched her in the soft light, something warm flickering behind his eyes. "You're tired," he said quietly. "Not the same kind of tired as before," she replied. "Not the kind that sinks into your bones. More like the kind after letting go of something heavy." He nodded. "Makes sense." They stepped inside, and warmth enveloped them. Marian slipped off her gloves, brushing her fingers along the smooth wood of the table, this time with familiarity, not uncertainty. Elias hung up their coats, then met her eyes. "You want tea, or something stronger?" Marian smiled faintly. "Tea. For now." He began preparing it, moving with that same steady rhythm she had come to rely on. She watched him, a soft ache forming in her chest, not painful, but poignant. She had traveled across states for a man who never truly saw her. Yet here, in a quiet cabin in the Montana winter, she had found someone who did. When Elias set the tea in front of her, she touched his hand just a brush of fingertips. Nothing more. He stilled. "Elias," she whispered. "I'm not sure what tomorrow brings, or the day after, but I know this. I want to be here. I want to stay, at least for now." His breath deepened, his eyes warming as if someone lit a lamp inside him. "I'm glad," he said, voice husky. "More than you know." Her cheeks warmed, but she didn't look away. "What about you?" she asked softly. "Does having me here unsettle your quiet?" He studied her for a long moment, gentle, unguarded. "No," he said. "It steadies it." Her heart swelled, not dramatically, not explosively, just steadily like spring thaw beneath winter ice. Later that night, when Marian settled near the fire with a blanket over her knees, Elias stepped outside to bring in more wood. The sky was deep blue, dusted with stars. His breath formed clouds as he paused on the porch, looking out across the snow-covered valley. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Quiet. Measured hope. The kind that didn't ask for anything in return, the kind born from simply wanting someone to be safe, to be at peace, to be there. He carried the wood back inside, where Marian sat with her eyes half closed, warm light brushing her features. As he set the wood by the hearth, she looked up. "You're thinking about something," she whispered. He joined her by the fire, sitting a respectful distance away. "Just thinking," he murmured, "how winter feels different this year." She smiled softly. "How so?" He looked into the fire, then into her eyes. "Feels less like something to survive, more like something to share." Her breath caught, and she lowered her gaze for a moment, overwhelmed not by fear, but by the gentleness settling around them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Then, let's share it," she whispered. And for the first time in years, Elias Carter felt the season shift not outside, but within. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. It wasn't dramatic, the season didn't break all at once. Instead, it softened in quiet hours, in the pale warmth of late mornings, in the sigh of snow turning to meltwater beneath the pines. The creek near Elias Carter's cabin began singing again, soft at first, then fuller as each day passed. Marian Ellis walked the length of the porch that morning, her boots tapping lightly against the thawing wood. She inhaled the crisp air, still laced with winter but touched now with a whisper of something new. Hope. Possibility. The faint scent of earth waking from long sleep. Elias stepped out behind her, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Mornin'," he said, voice warm. She turned, smiling softly. "Mornin'. I heard the creek running again." He nodded. "Spring's comin'. Slow, but steady. Like most good things," Marian said gently. Their eyes met for a moment that lingered warm, quiet, a recognition growing stronger by the day. Elias leaned against one of the porch posts. "You slept better last night." "I did," she said. "Something shifted in me. Maybe because I'm not waiting for the past to catch up anymore." He nodded slowly. "You're not running from anything now. Makes rest come easier." Marian looked out toward the meadow. Patches of brown earth peeked through the snow. Small birds hopped along the fence rails. Everything felt calmer inside her and around her. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said quietly. Elias straightened slightly, not tense, but attentive. "About what about staying?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he waited steady, patient, letting her find her words. Marian inhaled, letting the cool air fill her lungs. "When I first arrived," she began, "I wasn't choosing anything. I was just reacting, surviving, trying to figure out how to breathe after being left behind." Elias's gaze softened. "But lately," she continued, "things feel different. I'm not staying here because I'm lost. I'm staying because Because something about this place, about this cabin, about you, feels like a beginning." Elias's heart gave a tight, quiet pull. "And I don't want to leave a beginning," she whispered. Elias looked down at his hands for a moment, as if steadying the weight of her words. Then he said, voice low, "You don't owe me an answer today." "This is my answer," she said. He looked up sharply, meeting her gaze fully. "I want to stay. Not out of necessity, not out of fear, but out of choice. A choice I've thought hard about." Elias exhaled slowly, almost like a man unclenching a fist he had kept tight for too many years. "Then stay," he said softly, "as long as it feels right." She stepped closer to him, boots crunching softly on the thawing snow. "It feels right now," she said, "and that's enough for me." They headed inside for breakfast, biscuits and honey, leftover stew warmed on the stove, coffee strong enough to wake even a stubborn winter morning. Marian moved comfortably around the kitchen, knowing where Elias kept the dishes, the spoons, the flour tin. She didn't ask anymore. She simply did. And Elias? He watched her move with an ease that startled him, not because she took up space in his home, but because she belonged there without effort. They ate slowly, the fire crackling in the background. At one point, Marian paused, her spoon hovering above her bowl. "Elias," she said carefully, "when winter ends, when the roads open, people will talk more." He nodded calmly. "That's their business." "And us?" she asked softly. He looked at her a long moment. Not with hesitation, just depth. "That's our business," he said. Her eyes warmed, grateful. Later, Marian walked the property lines with Elias, learning the land as if memorizing a new language. He pointed out where the elk crossed in autumn, the old trapper's trail, the grove of cottonwoods that would bloom pale green come April. "And over here," he said, stopping near a wooden fence, "I'm fixing to plant more pasture grass," for what she asked. He glanced at her, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Well, if I'm expanding the herd, I'll need the room." She smiled. "You've been planning a future." "Guess I have," he said. With someone in mind, she asked quietly, half teasing, half holding her breath. Elias turned toward her fully, his expression softening into something that nearly stopped her heart. "Yes," he said simply. But I didn't want to say anything until she knew where she wanted to be. Marian looked down at her gloved hands, warmth blooming in her chest, and now she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice deep and quiet. "Now I reckon I can say it plain," before he could speak further. A voice echoed from across the field. Elijah Marian. It was Sheriff Amos Grant, riding toward them on his chestnut mare. Snow kicked up behind her hooves as he drew near. Elias frowned. Something wrong. "Amos." "Not wrong," Amos said, dismounting. "Just news." Marian stiffened slightly, but the sheriff's expression was calm. "Hollis Wren wired from Butte," Amos said. "Said he's leaving Montana Territory, heading south to Arizona. Won't be coming back through Clay Ridge." Marian let out a long, slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thought you'd want to know," Amos said gently. "Thank you, Sheriff," she murmured. Amos tipped his hat. "You look steadier than the last time I saw you." Marian smiled faintly. "I feel steadier." Amos glanced between the two of them, then gave a knowing nod. "You two take care now." When he rode off, Marian exhaled again, lighter this time. "It's done," she whispered. Elias nodded. "It's done." Her shoulders relaxed, fully finished with that chapter at last. That evening, the cabin glowed golden with lamplight. Marian set the table while Elias finished splitting the last of the winter logs. Outside, twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and indigo. After supper, Marian found Elias on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching the last streaks of color fade. She stepped beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter around her. "You're quiet," she said softly. "Just thinkin'." Elias replied, about what he turned toward her slowly steady, deliberate, about how life leads a man places he never expected. He said, "A month ago, I figured winter'd go like all the others, quiet, cold, lonely, but then you came, and the cabin didn't feel empty anymore." Marian's throat tightened. "You changed things," he said, "in a way I didn't see comin'." She reached out, fingertips brushing the back of his hand. "And you made me feel safe again," she whispered. He turned his hand, allowing her fingers to settle into his palm. His hand closed around hers, gentle but sure. "Marian," he said quietly, "I ain't a man who rushes anything, but I know this." He stepped closer, not to overwhelm, just to be near. "You being here feels right, more right than anything in a long time." Marian's eyes shimmered not with fear, but with something bright and tender. "I feel the same," she whispered. Elias lifted his free hand, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "You sure?" he asked gently. She nodded once. "Steady." "I'm sure." He exhaled, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire inside. "Then maybe," he murmured. "This is where our new beginning starts." Marian leaned into him, resting her forehead lightly against his chest. "It already has," she said softly. They stood together as the stars came out slow, bright, countless. Snow melted quietly along the eaves. The creek whispered somewhere in the dark. There were no grand declarations, no rushed promises, just two people who had weathered storms of their own, choosing calmly, bravely to walk forward together. Not out of need, not out of fear, but out of hope, out of choice, out of something gentle, growing and real. And when Elias finally whispered, "Their loss is my treasure," Marian closed her eyes, letting the words warm every part of her that winter had once frozen. Because this time, the words were not a rescue. They were a beginning, a home, a promise shared between steady hands and a healing heart. The story of Elias and Marian reminds us of something very true. Age does not determine the ability to love or heal. Whether at 40, 60, or 80 years old, the human heart still knows pain, knows loss, but also knows how to revive when meeting the right person. Sometimes, the silence of life, a house without human voices, a meal without warmth, is where each of us learns to face our own loneliness. But silence can also be strength, a space for new things to have a chance to enter. The biggest lesson here: happiness doesn't come from a perfect past, but from the courage to choose yourself in the present. No one is too old to change. No one is too late to start over. Thank you for listening to the story until the end. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that we have more motivation to bring more stories that touch your hearts.